Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. Well, I'm very honored to be here. Can we get the images pulled up, we hope? There we go. I'm very honored to be here. This is, well, as you all know, it's a very special event, and it's something that, for me, means a lot. Let me just note that there are many people that I really should thank, and I apologize if I don't thank everybody, but I do want to thank Mary Ann Libau. She's helped out in some of the illustrations, Paula Moore, Jack Porter, Steve Stimmel, and then there have been others, scholars who participated in this over the years, and particularly to note David Gebhard and his wife Pat Gebhard, who did a book on Purcell and Elmsley that helped to really bring them back, As you can tell from this image here, there's a building right there in that corner now, right? And I didn't really pose the cars there. This was taken, I think, in 1975, but I actually first came to see this building in 1973 when I was teaching at Iowa State University. And I've been back many times over the years. This was a few years ago. And as you can see, some of you should recognize yourselves there, the Steele family reunion here in 1997. And it is something that I think is very important because what I constantly see every time I come in here is something new, something different that I hadn't paid attention to. I don't know how many times that one can see, but this is really a very extraordinary building. As I say that when I first came here, of course it was to look at the outside. My goodness, a little town like Sioux City could have a building that was such as this. And of course the wonderful exterior detail, and then to go inside where we are right now, and well, it just knocks your socks off. You just simply can't believe of what it is that you see, but the architecture, outside, of course, the sculpture, inside here, the wonderful paintings. And what it does is that I think that it sort of goes and points towards one of the purposes that was in the mind of William Steele when this building was built. I am going to pay a little attention to some of the variations that went on, and I'll get to this in a few minutes, but as you can see right here on the left, there is a drawing by George Grant Elmsley that he probably did when he came down here in the initial visit. And then on the right is a scheme that was never carried out, but also do note that it's a little different, the sculptural details that are right there on this. Than the way it turned out, but also that this is to be a taller tower. But what we do have here are a group of architects who were intending to try to create something that was very unique. It was very individual, and there is, as I will be noting, there is some different opinions and so forth, and who did what, and who's absolutely responsible and so forth. And I'm not sure. I've tried to talk to a couple of them at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I've not quite gotten the exact answer that I want on this. But I do think that it is, maybe in a certain sense, it is a very interesting example of a collaboration by different individuals. William Steele, he liked to be known as Bill, in 1912 gave a talk here in Iowa, an address at the convention of Iowa Cement Users Association. But in this talk, and this is one of many, many talks that William Steele would give over the years. He actually became very well known for giving talks at different architecture groups and so forth. But in this talk of 1912, he says, and I quote, "The history of every nation is written in its architecture with more unerring truth than in the books." The truth of nations is in their architecture. It is not in their books. And then he went on, of course, this is talking about concrete here. Real architecture has always found its expression in the best, most durable materials available. But I think that what Steele is reflecting in this point that the history of every nation is something that John Ruskin, the great 19th century English writer, probably the most important, actually, English writer of the 19th century, who says that every form of noble architecture is some sort the embodiment of the polity, the life, the history, and the religious faith of nations. But also, I think that what Steele is reflecting is, and as you know, I teach at the University of Virginia. And as part of my contract at the University of Virginia, I must introduce Thomas Jefferson in every talk that I do. But Jefferson is responsible for the first public building built after the Revolution in this country, which is the Virginia State Capitol. And in a letter that he wrote to James Madison in 1785, trying to explain why this building would be built in Richmond and become the Virginia State Capitol. But I emphasize this is the first public building built after the Revolution, and I think sets in motion certain things. But Jefferson says, "But how is a taste in the beautiful art to be formed in our countrymen, unless we avail ourselves of every occasion when public buildings are to be erected, of presenting to them models for their study and imitation?" In other words, the public building embodies the values. They embody the values that's going on. And I would say that this is something that caught the imagination of other Americans. For instance, Louis Sullivan. And we'll be coming back to Louis Sullivan in a minute, but he's a very important figure in William Steele's life. But Louis Sullivan said in one place, well, he wrote an awful lot, let me say that. But Sullivan said, "That an architect, to be a true exponent of his time, must possess first, last, and always the sympathy, the intuition of a poet. Architecture is a study of the social conditions producing it, the study of a new type of civilization." And this is something that I think was very important. Now, Louis Sullivan, that is him posing in front of a house of his down in Mississippi on the left, but did design buildings such as you can see, which used to be a department store on State Street in Chicago. And he also invented, and this should look a little bit familiar, just looking around here, this type of an ornamentation that we see here. To go on with this with this here for a minute is just to note that in the minds of these individuals, especially back at the turn of the last century, there was this issue of what is American and really what it should be. Now, just a little footnote. We tend to call, and there were many pamphlets that's been handed out here that has described this as a prairie school building. I hate to tell you that the term prairie school was not invented until the late 1950s. It was not used at all back then. They did not use it then at all. Yes, we do have this wonderful book on the left by H. Allen Brooks, which is one of the classic studies, which was published in 1971. And there was a magazine, unfortunately no longer exists, actually edited by and put together by an Iowan by the name of Wilbert Hasbrook, who attended Iowa State University and published this magazine for a period of about 20 years. And this is where the term prairie school catches on, is with these things here. But if you went back, I think, and asked Bill Steele, hey, Bill, I really like your Prairie School building, he might look at you a little weirdly and say, wait a minute, what are you talking about here? Because actually the term that they were using back then was the new school of the Middle West, that this was the new thing that was emerging here. Now it is, again, this is a footnote. I'm a scholar, so I've got to use a lot of footnotes and so forth. It is worthwhile to note that there was that three-named guy out of Chicago, Frank Lloyd Wright, who did use the term prairie. Right there, I hope you can make it out. On the left, this is published in the Ladies' Home Journal in 1901, A Home in a Prairie Town. And Frank Lloyd Wright, in this here and in other places, he talks about the flatness of the prairie. But again, just to emphasize that this house right here, wonderful house in Mason City, was not known as a Prairie School house. This is something that we have put onto it. Put onto it since then. Now, what was, though, in the mind of people such as William or Bill Steele and these others, such as Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan, was, did America have an architecture? Or what is it that we did? We just imitated what it was that we were importing from Europe. Picking up a detail here, a building there, bringing it over, erecting it, putting up a state capitol or a public building in Des Moines. And let me just say, these are lovely buildings. They're worth being saved. But the idea that is behind these buildings was something that, well, we're going to get that there, and we're going to show those damn Europeans how we can do it. But what's going on, I think, with the people such as Steele and so forth, is that maybe we can do something else. Now, of course, we also have to keep in mind what were the other courthouses that were being erected. This is a time of big courthouse erection here in Iowa. And I don't know. I started out the other day trying to figure it out. And as I came up, it seemed to me like that there were something like 67 courthouses that were put up there at the turn of the century. And so this has to be put in the context that here they are up here in Sioux City or Woodbury County trying to keep up with the rest of the state. And so are we going to put up buildings that are such as this? Is there some way that we can do something that is different? Now, back into this for just a minute here about Louis Sullivan, that you begin to get emerging, especially in Chicago, but there are some other things, there are other places in the country, which I'm not going to bother to go into, where the architects and the artists, the painters, the sculptors, the poets, and I should note that Walt Whitman is an extremely important figure in all of this, and in the background of many of these people, is there something that is unique to us? What is it that we can try and create? And so Louis Sullivan, who Steele worked for, is a very seminal figure in all of this. But you can see that, of course, in the high-rise building, or a skyscraper that is in Buffalo, which is adorned with wonderful Sullivan-esque type of ornament, or there are a number of these banks that he did later on, such as this incredible little jewel box that's located in Grinnell, is that we've got to have something that is us. We've got to have something that is unique. And of course, in this, you do have, the three-named guy, Frank Lloyd Wright. And that Wright had worked for Louis Sullivan. He was there prior to William Steele being there, but he'd worked for Louis Sullivan, and he sets off, of course, in his own vision with buildings such as this, the wonderfully restored hotel in Mason City, and other architects such as Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Mahoney, who did a wonderful bunch of houses and so forth elsewhere, wound up down in Australia, designing the capital of Australia of all places. But this is a house that they did up in Mason City. So this is a little bit trying to put in that this is a little bit of the background that William Steele, Bill Steele, enters that William Steele enters into. You've heard a little bit of his background, but let me just go over it again just very briefly. He was born in Springfield, Illinois. He went to architecture school at the University of Illinois, and very, very important, his instructor there was a man by the name of Clarence Riker. And Riker ran what might be considered to be one of the most innovative architecture schools in the country at the time. And he was very much enthralled with the work that Sullivan was doing up in Chicago. So anyway, Steele studies at the University of Illinois, and then he goes up to Chicago, and he gets into the office of Louis Sullivan. Now, Louis Sullivan, he and his former partner, Dagmar Adler, had done the building here on the right, known as the Auditorium Building. It's still there. It's one of the great landmarks in Chicago. Sullivan's office was right up there at the very top floor in it. And this is where Steele went in, and one of Sullivan's office men, who was really running the office, was George Grant Elmsley. And Elmsley, I should note, was with Steele, with Sullivan for approximately 20 years. From 1889 to 1909, he worked for Louis Sullivan. And Sullivan, how to put this? He was a complex figure that believed that the architect's best friend was a lot of booze. There are stories that in the office, the boys would be working at their drafting tables, and that Sullivan would go to one of the windows up here and look out at the lake and do a little monologue. It might last 10 minutes, 15 minutes. It's reported that one day it lasted 8 hours. Now, Steele fell very much under Sullivan's. He admired Sullivan very much. He would refer to him as the sun god. He wrote his memoir when Sullivan died in 1924. He gave the talk on Sullivan at the American Institute of Architects in 1925. And in his various articles that William Steele wrote over the years, he very frequently quotes Louis Sullivan. He becomes very close friends with George Grant Elmsley, who's the man right here in the center, who I just mentioned, was in the office for about 20 years, and is able to keep Sullivan on some sort of a path up to 1909, when finally things come to the end. One of the things that Steele picked up in the office, of course, was Sullivan's very innovative type of ornament, such as I'm showing right here. And this ornament is done in the same ornament that was done here in this building, but this is the type of terracotta ornament. Sullivan came up with the idea, and he's drawing out of a variety of different books. And there is, I think safe to say, there is a sort of quasi-mystical, naturalistic endeavor that is in this ornament. But actually, Elmsley is a person who actually produces most of the design. Well, anyway, in 1900, Steele leaves the Sullivan office, and he goes off to Pittsburgh, where he works for a couple of different firms there, Adler and Harlow and Sidney Hecker, and worked on these buildings, or at least these buildings were in the architect's offices when he were there. And this is the type of work that he got there. But in 1903, he marries his old college sweetheart, high school sweetheart. And I should note that he was Catholic, and he was very much a Catholic all of his life. And in 1904, he decides to leave Pittsburgh. He picks up a partnership here in Sioux City and comes here in 1904. The partnership only lasts 2 years, and by 1906, he is on his own. Now, I don't really have to describe to you, I think, what Sioux City was like at the turn of the century, but here you have a couple of views and so forth of what it was. And it was a very, very, very profitable city. with a lot of railroads coming through, and of course you had the rivers and so forth, a lot of manufacturing going on, and reputedly it was the 99th largest city in the country at the time. Now, I haven't gone back and measured these things and so forth, but that is one of the things that was done. Now, what Steele does in his architecture here was, to put it bluntly, he starts out as, quote, a businessman architect. I will do what it is you want. And so he gave his clients what it is. And so there's approximately about 200 buildings, or maybe more, that were done here in Sioux City that reflect a whole variety of different sorts of styles and so forth. That he would certainly, as you can see, and I don't think this exists any longer there on the left, does it? It's gone, unfortunately. I took this picture thousands of years ago. But he did the Crane Company building. He teamed up with Mr. Tilden, William Tilden, who was a very noteworthy New York architect who was doing stuff for Carnegie Company, for Carnegie Libraries, and teamed up here on your own library. And as they say, he's a businessman architect. This is what you want? This is what I'll give you. I'll give you a good job. And he very quickly becomes, of course, the major figure in town. And one of the things is that he captures a lot of important people. And so for Mr. Moore, he does the building there, which I guess also I think is gone. Is that gone today? I'm afraid, fortunately. He does Mr. Moore's house as well. That's up in the Summit Road neighborhood. And there's a lot of this. And don't worry, I'm not going to go through every one of these. You do, though, begin to see with this, which of course is just practically next door with the Davidson building, that there begins to be maybe an architectural expression that he's trying to bring out. And that he's beginning to bring out the structural members in this. Now, the ornamentation is still very, very traditional, but this sort of the prominent piers, the recessed spandrels, this is very much what he would have known from the Louis Sullivan office. And then you begin to get, unfortunately, this is gone as well. I'm sorry, but anyway, this is where the first time where you saw him really using Sullivan type of ornament. But this is the addition to the Livestock National Bank. And I hope you can make out, I know these are a little dim, but this is very much a Louis Sullivan type of an ornamentation that he's using here, on the front of this. Henry Metz, who we've mentioned a few minutes ago, is a very important figure. And for Mr. Metz, he does a variety of different things. Metz owned this tremendously large bakery, had been born in Germany, came over. And for Metz, he does this row of apartment buildings, which are still up there and are still there today. And actually, the name on the corner there is the Metz apartment buildings. He does these buildings. But what is very important is that Henry Metz was the chairman of the County Board of Supervisors. What can be better? So the guy that I'm doing work for is the head, and we're going to do a new county courthouse. So what happens, and there is in some of the literature's been handed out and so forth, I won't go through this, that in February 1914, after a sort of a long, complicated period, Steele gets the job. And he becomes the official architect for the Woodbury County Courthouse. Now, there is stories that have roamed around, and they have been published, that he supposedly did a design for a very traditional building, but I have never seen any drawings of this at all, and I'm not quite sure about the truth of that. But in any event, he becomes the official architect. And so what happens is, and this is your old county courthouse right here, just to show you what the thing looked like that they wanted to replace. What it does is that he contacts his old buddy, his old friend, George Grant Elmsley, who by this point in time has left Louis Sullivan and is working with George Grant Purcell in an office both up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and down in Chicago. And that is them. That is Elmsley right here in the office. And Purcell and Elmsley, there was another partner by the name of Feek for a brief period of time, had done a whole series of buildings, such as this wonderful bank building, as you can see here in Winona, which is very Sullivan-esque in certain ways, with very much of the Sullivan type of ornament. And they had really emerged as a sort of a top team of architects. Well, anyway, Elmsley gets this, probably a telegram from Steele, would you help me out? And so he comes down, and what we have is we have this drawing here, and as you can see, it is sketched on the Chicago and Northwestern Railway stationery. And he comes up with this sort of a scheme for this large base, then with a tower rising out of it, and then out of the tower there's going to be another tower, which is labeled, which he writes right here, a flower in form and color. And you can see here the basic form of what the building will be, though this little tower to the side, the flower will never be erected. Now it's worthwhile to note there, and then these are some drawings. They were in color, but unfortunately all we have are black and whites of these, which are in the Purcell and Elmsley archives up in Minneapolis. They did a number of different, a number of different color studies and so forth, working on the massing of the building. And if you look very, very carefully, you can see that they're trying to figure out exactly how is it that we're going to handle the windows, the alignment and all of this. Here's a photograph, as you can see, of the office. We think about February 1916, and this is Steele right here, and this guy gazing off here, that's George Grant Elmsley, sort of gazing off over to the side. And as you can see, Steele has for that point in time, a rather sizable architectural office. Of course, there's a couple of ladies here, a lot of people wearing bow ties, as you see. You're supposed to do that if you're an architect. But what is interesting is that in the end of this job, Elmsley is paid for 1,535 hours on the job here. 1,535 hours. So it is safe to say that he is very, very principally responsible for certain elements. I should note that William Gray Purcell, his partner, is paid paid for 34 hours, and he basically contributes some of the ideas for some of the sculpture out in front and for the murals that are inside here, and gets Mr. Norton and Mr. Ianelli to come in. This is the 8-story tower type of a scheme here. They attempted at one point in time to add 2 stories to it, but the County Board of Supervisors say they will not allow that, so it is only a 6-story tower. This is another scheme here, which was done in color, but all I've been able to recover of this is, unfortunately, this rather primitive photograph of that, where you can see a different type of a roof that's up here. And the whole point is that the design does go through evolution. Now, as I just said, Elmsley contributes more than 1,500 hours to the job. But who is principally responsible? And this always gets to the problem of who does what. And you have the people that are working on the job, but you also have to have the person that's overall in charge. Who is it that's going to sell this thing? Who is it that's going to see this thing through? And it's very clear that it is Steele that is do that. One of the things that is interesting in the design, I'm not going to go through all of this because I'm sure that you all know it very well, but one thing was that they had a real problem with, they had the old federal building here in the corner, and were in competition with that. And this is a sort of a Romanesque sort of a structure, also described as Italianate. Well, we don't want to do that, so we're doing something very different, but we've got to have a tower that is as damn tall as the tower there on the corner. The other thing is that when you look at the base of this, as you go around to the sides, you can see that it changes the elevations and so forth. There's your courtrooms, which are on the sides, have different sorts of windows that are out from the windows that are going out to the front. And so that you have the different sorts of functions, and so forth. Of course, it has a lot of ornament, and I'm going to leave it up to Tim Samuelson to go into this because this is a story in of itself. And it is worthwhile to note that Louis Sullivan, in one of his many, many, many writings, does say that ornament tells the story of a building. And this is a point in time, well, today we've gotten away with ornament in buildings, but ornament was a very important way of conveying meaning and so forth, meaning and so forth to the public. Oh, here it is again, the comparison. I guess I got my slides a little bit out of order here, but a comparison of the front, as you can see. And what it is, really, if you look at this, this is sort of an abstracted classical temple. You have these piers, but they are square. They've got column capitals on them. Then as you go around to the side, you change your function because you have different sorts of purposes that go around. But it does have this sort of a reference that looks back to the past, but at the same time also, of course, it is being done very modern. There is an architect who was from Chicago at one time who said God is in the details, and the details are very important. Of course, the Roman, this long, narrow, yellowish Roman brick. This isn't the common type of brick. This is the Roman brick. The way that you have your joints that are incised horizontally and then filled up in verticals, and the details on this is just very, very much a sort of perfection. Then, of course, we come inside, and we come into the space that we have here. And, well, what do we have? The murals here were done by John Norton. I'm not going to try. You're going to have a test at the end of this. What does this one represent? What does this one represent over here? What does this one represent back here? And, of course, that back there. But you're having what? Industry, farming. But it is, and the extravagance of the exterior, of course, continues here on the inside. And the wonderful capitals, these white terracotta capitals, again, done by Northwest Terracotta Company. Simply amazing. But both are scaled. You want to imagine trying to put those up there. The dome. You all seen the video, so I don't need to go getting up there inside the dome. I did make it one year once to get up in there. Rather incongruous, though. Do you expect a dome from the exterior? Do you see a dome on the exterior of this building? But here we have it inside, and I think that goes to a symbolism about the dome as a sense of unity and bringing together, and very much of a civic sort of notion. Then the courtrooms, which are a very different sort of a space in their own way, have their own and wonderful detail, but they're much calmer sort of a space for the different types of activities that are taking place there. Now, Steele, as I said, did about more than 200 buildings here in Sioux City. And what is interesting that with this building here and the work that he's beginning to do around 1912 to 1914, he's beginning to discover his own vision. And so he begins to do houses such as this. Some of us went through this house here in the afternoon. Just down the street is the Everest House. But he begins to do work that's around town. Not all of us exactly the same. He is still acey-deucey. He is, and I think it's safe to say that he is experimenting. Of course, he does a number of branch libraries. This is one on the right. We all know, I'm assuming you all know, the church there that is on the left. What is very interesting, I think, is that Steele was able to create an amazing architectural career out here on really the farming frontier, and to create buildings. And we could go on and on and on over to Yankton College, or as we see right here, but that he was able to do buildings able to do buildings such as this. The building was published in a couple of different places, but in particular, there was an article, and it appears to me, and to some other scholars, it appeared in the Western Architect magazine, as you can see, February 1921, and you have up there William Steele, and then Purcell and Elmsley. But in this article, at the conclusion of it, and I think it is Steele that is probably writing this, he says that what we have done is we've put new life into what has been so long held sacred as purely monumental and therefore classical. Quotation, i.e., it is not classical. He goes on and he says, let it make every brick and every stone in our public buildings proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. Thank you very much.